Hey, welcome to the Zeitgeist on a Mighty Blaze. I am your host, Jane Roper, and I'm thrilled to have with us today. Oh, I'm looking for my copy of the book, and I think it's like across the room. You have a copy of the book, though. Ronit Plank, who is the author of When She Comes Back. Wonderful memoir. Ronit, welcome to A Mighty Blaze. We're so happy to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here, and I love watching your show, Jane.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're such a good question asker.
Oh,
and
thank
funny.
you. Thank you. Well, no, now I have the pressure.
No pressure.
So, yeah, pressure's on. Ronit is the author of When She Comes Back, a coming-of-age memoir about the loss of her mother to Guru Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh. I don't know if I got that right. Yes.
You got it right.
Okay. Her essays have been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, HuffPo, The Rumpus, and The Seattle Times, among others. Her short stories have won prizes or special mention in the Iowa Review, American Literary Review. Oh, that's hard to say. American Literary Review. That's a lot of R's. Narrative Magazine, Third Coast Magazine, and Hunger Mountain. She holds a Master of Fine Arts in Nonfiction from Pacific University and is the host and creator of the award-winning podcast And Then Everything Changed, featuring interviews with survivors, authors, and thought leaders about pivotal moments in their lives and decisions that have defined them. I have not checked it out yet, but I can't wait. It sounds wonderful. Her short story collection, Home is a Made-Up Place, will be published by Sewillow Press in 2022.
You got it all.
What's that? I got it all. I got everything. All your whole life story. And so we're here to celebrate today When She Comes Back, your debut memoir. And for folks who are watching, if you can leave a comment or question and you haven't won a book on the Zeitgeist before, then you will be eligible to win a copy. We'll send that out to you. So if you're here, say hello, ask a question, make a comment. And we will, of course, do our best to respond and get all of your questions to Ronit. Joanna Rakoff, our mutual friend, the author of My Salinger Year, calls When She Comes Back a pitch-perfect novelistic depiction of a childhood cut short by instability and loss. When She Comes Back reminded me of Jeanette Wallace's The Glass Castle. That's a good comparison. But Plank's voice is purely her own, laced with humor and underpinned by deep, hard-won wisdom and self-knowledge. I loved it, and you will too. So, gosh, where to begin? Do you want to tell us a little bit about what compelled you to write this book? When did you decide that you wanted to write about your childhood?
Well, I don't know. I think I was sort of like, I was a little bit of a shy memoirist, and I had started off in short fiction. I started off as an actor. I was never going to be a writer. It was not something in my head at all. Working with animals, being an actor, like that was what I wanted to do. And then when I had my second child, they're both teenagers now, but when I had my second, I started taking writing classes at University of Washington, their certificate program, not even knowing if I was a fiction writer or a nonfiction writer. So I chose fiction. I started writing short stories. And because I think of my acting experience and being rejected in front of my face at auditions, my last adult life, I had no shame about sending my stories out. I was just like, the New Yorker, here's a story, like just sending them out.
Yeah.
And so then after a couple of years of that, I went to my master's program thinking I was going to continue with fiction, and kind of hit a wall and went over to nonfiction because I'd been publishing essays about my life, short, little, discrete essays about growing up and my mom and, the guru and like the loss that I experienced. And when I went into my nonfiction program, my teacher, Deborah Gwartney, said, why don't you just write the memoir already? And I was shy about it. I felt I didn't understand memoir. I had been raised in my writing life on fiction, and I understood the structure of fiction, and memoir can be really different. And I was a little bit hesitant, but I started writing it. And part of her advice was, if you don't write your story, if you don't tell it, who will? Because I thought, well, my story isn't that hard or difficult. Why do I need to share it? It's not that big. Things happen to people all the time. Right. But, it's not just about what happened to you. It's what you make of what happened and the memories that you have. And so I would say I wrote the first draft in 2017. And then I started, revising it. And then Wild Wild Country on Netflix came out after I was already shopping it around. And so I added some material to that, what watching that Netflix docuseries was like. after I had this book, in my system. And then the rest is history. I got the book, I found my publisher and I got the book, and I can't believe it's out and it's here.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's great. It must have been strange and probably revealing in a lot of ways to see the documentary and, have a fresh view of the stuff that went on within the cult. And did you learn things from it that you weren't aware of before?
Yes. I really was nervous to watch it. And that's a bit in the book as well. I had this kind of duality of wanting to see where my mom was and what this place was like, that to me was just sort of like a myth, and not wanting to see any of it. And the same held for whether or not my mom was going to be in the footage. Here you have thousands and thousands of Westerners, with dark hair, fair skin, like my mom. And I just like poured over all of the images to see if I could find her. And I was really interested in the backstory. There are 6 episodes, and I got to see footage in India, and I got to see footage in Antelope, Oregon, and learn about the more nefarious goings on and things like that, and got the backstory. And so here was a story that I had heard second or third hand through my father and what I could piece together from my mother when I was 12, moving into an adult space where I have my life as a mom and as a writer and as a really circumspect person and very against coercive movements, watching it and consuming it.
Yeah. Whole different experience. So your story begins, and where you start is on a kibbutz in Israel, where you lived with your mom and dad when you were very young. So that you were born there too, is that right? Or were you born in the States?
Yeah, my parents are American. My parents were New York Jews, basically. And they went over there in 1968 onto a kibbutz where the idea was to sort of settle the land and cultivate the land and create a society. And it was very socialist. It was a communal work farm. That's what a kibbutz is. These days, they're a little more capitalist. You can like pay rent to be there. Right. But then you would work in a job there. And so my mom worked in the kitchen, my father worked in the fields, and then with the animals. And I was raised collectively with a whole bunch of other children in my age group. And I only spent about 2 hours a day with my parents on the lawn in the afternoons and slept in a children's house. So my feeling about the world, the best that I can, recollect and just kind of go back in time, was security, confidence, safety, the natural world, animals, knowing there are a whole bunch of adults there and sort of an infrastructure to keep me safe.
Yeah. And when your family went back home, it really changed the nature of the relationship and the structure. And for your mother, especially, not having that kind of support really rocked her. Can you talk more about what the effect was of her coming back and leaving the kibbutz life?
Yes. So the picture, you can think of is you leave this land where everything is provided and you've had your 20s basically taken care of. My mom didn't even know how to write a check. Everything was provided by the community and she knew everyone. Yeah. And she and my father moved to Washington where they never lived before, so he could go to University of Washington. And she's home alone with the kids all the time. I have a younger sister. And so I'm 4.5, 5. My father is out of the house for the, a lot of the day. I'm in a house with my mom for the first time ever in my life. I'm sleeping there. My mom now has to mother around the clock. She has no friends to rely on. She has no family to rely on. The city is a very Scandinavian, wet, rainy city, and there's no community, and we had very little money. And so this was sort of a crisis for her. And I think that a lot of people become parents without really understanding the full role or understanding how demanding it can be. I didn't become a mom till I was 32, but I absolutely was unprepared for some of it. And so here was a 24-year-old who had kids, had me at 24. So it was very challenging. And then they fell into the marriage issues that a lot of marriages face early on and throughout, which is, who are you? What am I doing with you? Are we compatible? And so everything just fell apart. And when my father went to Newark, New Jersey to start his new life there, he left me and my sister with my mom in Seattle. And my mom was pretty much isolated and started following, the teachings of Bhagwan Shree Rajneesh.
Right. Yeah, I just kept thinking about what, that communal atmosphere on the kibbutz and the kind of support that women had for child rearing and the way everyone took care of each other, and really how like isolating American and most like Western, well, some countries are better about supporting, parents than others, but America's generally not one of those.
Yeah,
And,
definitely not when you look at parental leave and stuff like that. Not at all.
Right, exactly. But I also kept thinking about, and I think we're roughly the same age, but so, our mothers sort of being mothers in the 70s, at this real crossroads for women, where there's this sort of like new idea of liberation and women getting careers and women having more freedom. But at the same time, they're still very much the ones saddled with child rearing. And so, I was just very much aware of that.
No, it's really, and I think that's important for me too, because as I wrote the book, I got to go a little further into my mom's experience and to try to understand what it would be like. And I think that was part of the piece that I needed, because I didn't want to just, plop out this story of how I was left and how hard it was and blah, blah, blah. Like I had to also interrogate my own experience, the way I handled things as an older child, and also what the circumstances were for my mom. Like you can put things on paper, but without kind of the idea of the surrounding situations and the context, you don't really understand how someone lives, which is part of the reason I think stories are so powerful and why we're drawn to them, because we can kind of inhabit someone's reality for a while. And I felt really bad for my mom. I mean, I'm sorry, like I'm really upset that, I didn't get to grow up with her. I've come to some peace with that, but I mean, she wasn't prepared. And in some ways, I don't know that my sister and I would have been better off being raised with her anyway.
Interesting. Yeah. What do you think drew her to the cult specifically? What do you think it was about what they were teaching or what they provided?
Well, she told me in a later conversation that she was really unhappy, and she had gone from her mother's house in Brooklyn to living with my father on a kibbutz, to then living with my father, to then nothing. And so she had never really been an adult in the world and relying on herself. And she knew, I think, that there had to be more. I think she understood that, and that was part of the whole 70s too, and the 60s, like search for something more spiritual, elevate yourself. Don't just take what you have in front of you and accept it. You can self-actualize. And what Bhagwan was teaching was what a lot of spiritual masters teach. I mean, there are tons of gurus out there and lots of cults, but his was one that was founded on dynamic meditation and sensory happiness and sex and sensuality and embracing the young child within you and not feeling tied down to family and children. He even felt that children were sort of a hindrance to enlightenment. So this idea that, hey, followers or sannyasins in his terms, your life and your joy is really paramount, and you get to search what you need. And so there was almost this permission to leave your family and leave your ties because you were the most important thing.
Right.
And that's very appealing, right? I mean, that's like, who wouldn't want to be told that if you're already unhappy?
Right. Exactly.
He was also called the sex guru, which I don't know if you knew that. Like, I didn't know that until my 40s.
I did not know that. No.
Yes. I found that out late. And I couldn't believe it. And I realized now exactly how irritated my father must have been with the whole situation, because not only was his ex-wife leaving the kids with him, going abroad to a guru, but she also was part of this movement where he was known as the sex guru, which, must have given him some feelings.
No doubt. Yeah. Absolutely. You wrote so beautifully in the book about the feelings of abandonment that you felt, but also this feel as a child, but you also felt like, why aren't I enough? Is it something about me, or is it you felt like, is it my responsibility to try to keep her from leaving? And what was it like going back and examining those emotions that you felt as a child?
Yeah. It's funny about the memoir process, especially when you're writing sort of a coming of age book. I mean, if I ever write a memoir about my adult life, it might be similar but different in ways. And I think this idea of going back and dropping in on yourself and the scene of your life, now that you have tools and now that you have these adult wits about you and perspective, is a gift, sort of, because you couldn't do anything when you were a kid about your circumstances, but now you're an adult and you have this idea and this sort of bird's eye view. So you can kind of see all the players in the scene in a different way from above. And so I understood better what my experience was back then. I didn't have words for it back then. Sure. I was just doing, pardon the like expression, but I was just doing me. I was just doing me the best I could. And I was a type A, older child to boot, big sister, bossy sister, really wanted to be in charge and also be my father's sort of like partner or, equal. And he gave me so much free reign and so much flexibility and power in our family to cook and clean and all that. But later on, I didn't want it. And so I put the blame on myself. I thought that it was my problem that I had too much of an adult position in the family. As an adult going back and looking at it, it was kind of a relief to see, well, no, I think he probably could have done better with boundaries. And no, probably it had nothing to do with what kind of a kid I was that my mom left. That was, I was in my 30s before I had kids when a therapist I had in Los Angeles I said to her, we were such good kids. I don't know why my mom left. And she looked at me kind of incredulous, like it had nothing to do with what kind of kids you were. But I truly, even in my 30s, didn't understand that. Now that I'm a mom, of course I understand that, right? But when you grow up with this feeling, so writing a memoir was empowering and it was illuminating for me. And it really clarified what was my responsibility or fault and what had nothing to do with me.
Right. And I think for those of us who are that sort of type A, who want to please, who want to do the right thing, who, are achievers, it's hard not to, because you're so responsible for yourself and so good at taking initiative. It's hard not to be like, well, what did I do wrong? What's my role in this?
Yes.
And sometimes it really comes down to, well, some grownups are not being very good grownups.
And it's more common than you think. And in fact, that idea of insecure attachment and parentification, I didn't even know the term parentification until 2 years ago. And the idea of insecure attachment or that kind of insecure childhood is something I'm really interested in. I wrote a thesis on it. And there are a lot of memoirs in this category of kid who's trying to make it through the world. Exactly like Glass Castle, Borrowed Finery, This Boy's Life. Kids who are sort of trying to figure out their way without the guardianship of an adult who's being an adult. And it really puts a kid in an interesting position. I was just talking today with someone on Facebook I know about how the mental illness in her family with her mother created the same feeling for her of insecure childhood and attachment. And it creates a whole bunch of behavior in you that people who don't experience that wouldn't have. Insecurity, fear of intimacy, fear of vulnerability. And it can really do damage until you kind of dismantle it.
Yep. I will not get into talking about myself. I won't turn into a therapy session, but I have to say, that really resonated with me as someone who was put in a similar position as a child and teen of being, my dad's confidant and best friend for a little while. And there really is there's like a guilt involved too. This, am I bringing this on? Am I blurring some boundaries that shouldn't be? And I thought it was really brave of you, honestly, to go there, to go to those feelings of discomfort when there is I read another great memoir recently, Wild Game.
Yes, I love that.
Right, but it's also about a parent breaching a boundary, right? Her mother
in the biggest way.
In the worst way, right? She shares her affair, and her daughter's in on the fact that she's having an affair.
Oh, it's so much
to put that on a child, right?
Yes. But I think it's look, I think I'm a pretty good mom, but I've made mistakes. There have been times where my husband was like, "Why'd you tell them about that thing that happened downtown? Why'd you tell them about that big battle in Afghanistan? Why'd you tell them that?" I want to share things, and I have good boundaries to an extent. But you can imagine how easy it is to do this. And I want to say thank you so let me say thank you for noticing that, because I had the hardest time writing that part about my father. So writing about my mom was somewhat easy in a sense because I've sort of told this story my whole life. Oh, my mom followed a guru, ha ha ha. You know, I knew how to manipulate it into kind of a one-liner or just like an offhanded thing. But my father, never did I tell him, hey, I'm kind of uncomfortable with you talking to me about your sex life. And I'm kind of uncomfortable about the fact that we sit so close together. And I'm uncomfortable with this role. I don't want this role anymore. But I never said it because many things, for me, I think my own recipe was afraid what would happen if I made him mad. Maybe it was my fault. What's wrong with me for having thoughts that this is uncomfortable? Aren't most kids comfortable with their father? And so for me as a writer, I think one of the bigger risks in writing this memoir, that was the area that I did not want to write, that I really was hoping to omit, but I knew I had to do it. And it was sort of the second layer in the book or the memoir where you think you know what your story is, but then this is like the secondary story, the other like subtext that's running through it that became sort of a revelation for me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it took it to a whole other level. And I really think the way you were able to connect it with how your mother was absent. So you ended up filling this role and your father ended up filling this, more intense role. And I think, in any memoir or essay, the more vulnerable you make yourself by digging under the surface and getting at those painful and sometimes awkward truths, like the more you connect with readers. And
yes, I do think I've written about that a little bit too. During this book launch season, there's been some really great opportunities to talk to different people and be in articles. And I have talked about how part of a really good amount of tension in a memoir can be the kind of the friction and the tension between what you want to believe about yourself and what the truth is, as because you don't want to just be the hero of a memoir. You don't want to write a book that just pats yourself on the back all the time. That's not interesting. And the reader can sense that. I mean, I really feel readers are so smart and they know and they can figure out whether or not there's honesty there.
Yeah,
and they read that you're interrogating yourself.
Right. And they can tell when you're withholding, an astute reader, and they're just not going to have the same kind of experience with a book, if it stays on that top level. I think
if you're reading a memoir, you're craving a certain type of story. And if you're reading a memoir about abandonment in childhood and parents who aren't wanting to be parents, then you probably signed up for a good, let's sit down, meat and potatoes type of story. And so I feel like as a memoirist, you should probably deliver that, right? Including your ugly sides.
Right. So let's talk about, the fact that your parents read this and, let me back up first. There is sort of a reconciliation, that, and forgiveness and deeper level of understanding that you come to with your mom at the end of the book. But knowing that, writing about them and having them read the book, what was that like?
Yeah, it was tricky. I now feel so happy I can take it for granted a little bit. But when I switched from fiction to nonfiction in my graduate program a couple of years ago, and I told my mom I was writing a memoir, it was just sort of like this blank expression, like, oh gosh, I know what that memoir is going to be about.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Okay. And everyone, I think, was just not sure what I was going to write. And so I held off on showing anyone the manuscript until I knew it was going to see the light of day. Yeah. There was no reason in my mind to say, hey, look at my story and my truth, if it never was going to be seen by anyone else. Sure. So I didn't feel any kind of, impulse to show them everything. Mm-hmm. But they had read some of my shorter pieces about growing up. And so they kind of knew what the tone would be. Yeah. And so I showed it to my mom, my sister, and my dad when I was pretty much ready. And my sister had some, a couple of things to add. And, don't you remember this? Don't you remember that? And I included it. And she said, it's really weird to read about yourself as a character in a book. And I was like, I get it. And then my dad gave me 9 pages of single-spaced notes and an email, which included Hebrew corrections and timeline corrections. And then he went to bat about some things that he disagreed with and felt were incorrect, or I was portraying him in a way he didn't like, and kind of had some complaints about it. So we had that conversation, which got a little heated because my dad and I really know how to go at it.
Mhm.
And then my mom was relieved, fairly relieved. I'm sure she'd be more relieved if I had never written the book, but she was very relieved that this was the version that was coming out, because she felt that I had really tempered the story with a look at how she might have been experiencing our story, and with adding that conversation at the end of the book, the epilogue. So all in all, we have made it past the release of my book, and my family is like talking to me, and
They're still speaking to you. Good.
yes,
Good.
and
Yeah.
even my mom was so funny. She's like, "Oh, I can't tune into that, interview, or I'm not going to read that article." And then she did pop in and read one, and then she ended up listening to me on NPR and during an interview a couple months ago, and she was like, "I loved it. It was so great." And so I was so relieved, because when your parents are listening, oh my goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. And when they're stars of the story, I mean, you're the ultimate star of the story.
No,
and I think that's what is so, some people don't understand about memoir is like, ultimately you may be writing about your family, but you're really writing about yourself. I mean,
well, it is, because so I really feel it's important to mention for anyone writing their own story or loving memoir is that, this story happened to my sister and me, and all of us, but we each would write a different book about it. So the idea that so part of what happened to me had nothing to do with me, but the way that a lot of it had nothing to do with me, but the way I reacted to it and the way I grew up with it is everything to do with me and my MO, which is why my sister could write a book that would be completely different, even though we grew up the same way. And that's part of that whole idea of your story matters.
Yep.
The world has room for you. There's no end to the different experiences we have.
Right. And your story doesn't have to be extraordinary. You don't have to do some great, crazy thing in order to have your story be worthy. And it doesn't even need to be a particularly tragic story. I mean, you have this sort of the hook of something sort of timely and that people are talking about. But what I admired was you didn't sensationalize it, right? You didn't go in and give all kinds of, I mean, you did air a little dirty laundry of the cult, and some pretty shitty things that were going on. But you didn't sensationalize, and you didn't try to make it like more than it was.
Yes. And I'm sure I could have, if I were famous and if I had killed somebody, or if I had gone to the cult myself, if I had done any of those things, then definitely this would be a different kind of book. But I had to, this was the backdrop of my story, but at its core, the story is about trying to grow up and become the person you're meant to be when you don't have the scaffolding for it, and there are no words or, ways to express that. And I think a lot of people would be able to understand that, because so many of us grow up in ways that are difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked a little about this when we were talking about boundaries, but how do you think your experience growing up has affected the kind of mother you are, or the kind of relationship you have with your kids? And I think we both have teenagers, so.
Oh yeah, I saw pictures of your little, the older picture of your daughters, right? You have twins, and they're so sweet. And God bless you, you had twins. Oh my goodness. My kids are 16 and 14, and it's such a different bag, because I knew I wanted to be a mom, but I didn't understand what was entailed. And I'm not like a neglectful mom. I'm a very hands-on mom. I still write them notes when they're going out, and I still leave them notes. I'm a little overbearing that way, but I also give them their freedom. My main thing, and I think my husband too, was for them to always know how much we love them, but not only just that we love them, because my father and my mom always told me that they loved me, but that I was present with them, and that I let them know that they were important, that their experience was important, that their feelings are important, that, that what's going on with me has nothing to do with them. I think that for me, and part of this is generational, I think, although maybe someone has a different experience. My parents didn't really talk a lot about their feelings or their fears or what was going on for them. It wasn't like, hey, kids, I'm feeling really nervous. And because I'm feeling really nervous, I'm really quiet right now. Or I'm very tired and I love you, but I really just need to not hang with you right now. It was just silence, or, kind of a distant face, and me being who I am filled in all the blanks, which were, maybe I'm boring my mom, or my mom doesn't like me, or, all these things. And so for me, I probably go overboard on the narration, or I have in the past. I remember once a family therapist told us a long time ago, Ronit, you need to narrate less. And, you're to the kids, like, this is what we're doing. This is where we're going. And your husband needs to narrate more. So, like those are the ways I overcompensate, probably. And also I would say it was an interesting experience to watch my daughter and my son turn the age as I was when this happened in my family, and to kind of witness, and this was a hard part, watch my mom with the kids being a very maternal grandmother and wondering what had happened for me and why couldn't she do it for me?
Right. There must have been some anger there, maybe.
Yes, I was a little pissy for a while, and I acted out my teenage years in my 30s and 40s with her. And then I kind of came to a new understanding. We had this big conversation, which ended up in the end of the book. Mm-hmm. And we are in a much better, more honest place now.
That's great. So we have a question from Marjut, my friend over in Finland. Would you have written the book if your mother or father weren't in your life and were able to read it before publishing it? That's interesting.
That's a great question. No one's ever asked me that. I think I would. Definitely, I think I would. And definitely I would. It's much easier, at least in the conversations I have with memoirists, not to show anybody, because goodness, it's so frightening to show people before the manuscript goes out. And I actually did an article on this for Writer's Digest, and I interviewed some writers, and some were like, no way did I show my memoir to anyone, because it's none of their business. That whole idea of like, they should have acted better if they didn't want you to write about them, that people talk about. Yeah. And for me, if my parents were no longer living, I would have gone to town with the book for sure. And I wouldn't have felt any worries about publishing it all. I felt a great sense of responsibility because I changed the names for everyone in the book, including even the teacher that I loved. Like, I just didn't want it to be about those people's names and follow them. It was more about the story. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Now that's it is interesting to think like that, what a different kind of book it would have been if you have your audience. I mean, even though your parents obviously weren't your primary audience, you can't not think about their presence.
No, but I think in a way it kept me responsible. And I see Phyllis Bernstein's comment, very brave of you to reveal your life history.
Yes,
I appreciate that. I think I also want to say that I did some work. We're always works in progress, but I'm really different, I feel like, at least in the way I behave, than I even was 10 years ago. I was still with those patterns that I learned growing up, those survival instincts. It took me a long time to listen. And that's part of the reason I have the podcast now, because I feel so much more engaged in other people's stories. I spent so much of my life just and acting and trying to prove to myself I was worth something. And so I think I calmed down as I became more vulnerable in my marriage, and as I understood what I was responsible for, and being vulnerable and looking at my behavior, always a work in progress, has made me, I think, a more compassionate listener and more understanding of people who are not living like I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Folks who are watching, please, if you have any more questions, please feel to throw them in the comments. If you want to be entered to win a copy of the book, just even if you don't want to ask a question, just say hi and let us know you're here. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your other work. So you have a short story collection coming out. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So the short stories I wrote at the beginning of my writing time have been published, all of them but one that's in the collection. And so last year, when my book was just starting to get ready to, launch, I heard from Hidden River Arts, and I heard from Deborah Scott there that I was the winner of the 2020 Eludia Award, which was for women over 40. And so Sowilo Press, which is an imprint of Hidden River Arts, is publishing it in early spring. And this is a collection of different short stories that I've written over time. And I think what's kind of like makes me feel a little sheepish is that, when I was writing fiction, and I'm very interested in fiction writers, I always want to snoop around and ask them, what's real? How much of this is based on your true experience? Part of me knew I was like a memoirist and a nonfiction writer as well, when I always wanted to know in the books, did this really happen? Who's this based on? And so reading those short stories, which will come out soon, I'm really excited about that. It's like they had a second life, because I wrote them, they got published. I'm proud of them. They were made in this time of my life. And now they get to come out under one cover, which I'm so happy about. And I think readers, if they've read my memoir, will notice there are some similar themes there, though the voices are all different, but there's a sense of loss or trying to find one's place in the world. And it also has a little to do with what I experienced raising my children in different characters. So I'm excited about that. It's a totally different bag than what I'm doing now with the memoir. And then after that, I have 2 other books. I have a young adult novel in progress.
Oh,
and
great.
I have, yes, and I'm just getting set to work on a nonfiction book proposal for a new book I have, which would be interview, anecdote, and history based. And I'm excited about that. I just need to get cracking. And the kids are supposed to go to school with masks in a couple of weeks, and I feel like I can really dig in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mine are heading back to school with masks also in a couple of weeks, and it's just easier, when they're in the house. I'm sure you experience this. Even if they're not bugging you, it's just easier.
Oh my gosh. Don't even get me started. I'm like this. I'm like on my keyboard and then I hear mom. And I'm like, oh. And, there's lots of food being made. There's lots of people getting rides, places. There's, I have the whole thing and I love it. And I also tell myself they're going to be gone in a couple of years. If they successfully launch, right? Knock wood, they successfully launch. I'll miss this time. And also I can tell you, I don't know about you, like one of my biggest habits, if I have to start a project and I haven't, is I clean. So I cleaned up my whole office last week after months and months of like the launch. And you could tell like the reason it looks so beautiful is because I was holding off. I was basically like trying not to get started on the writing, which is why it looks so beautiful. And now it's time to write.
Yeah, no, totally. It's a perfect procrastination, and you can tell yourself, no, I need it to be.
I need the space. I need to be clean. I hung up new pictures. I alphabetized my fiction and my nonfiction. I was like, look at all my books, and now it's time to actually write another book.
Right. That's the hard part. I mean, So, do you want to give a little commercial for your podcast?
Yes, I want to hear about that. You read my mind. So I started my podcast almost 2 years ago, and I'm nearing my 100th episode. In fact, I think you know this, but Joanna Rakoff was just a guest, and Laura Davis, who wrote The Courage to Heal in the 80s, is coming on in a couple of weeks. And Allison Hong Merrill is coming on. And so they're not all authors. Yeah, she wrote 99 Fire Hoops. It's coming out shortly. Yeah. And so it's all like this little community once you start to know everyone. And so I interview authors, people in recovery, and people who are thought leaders and kind of social justice warriors. I've had a real big range of people. I've had people who've, have survived addiction. I've had people who ended up in the foster care system. I've had, like everything. And so we talk about what was the beginning of the situation that you started this way, your life with? What happened to change it, maybe from the external or from your own trajectory? And actually, I had Mikel Jolet. Do you know him? He wrote Hollywood Park. It's a beautiful memoir. I highly recommend, from Celadon Books, and he's also in a band. And so he was my guest, and he had a cult parent situation too. And then we talk about what changed. And this has to do with my interest in resilience and my interest in survival. And it's really a platform for my guests to talk about themselves. I don't do a lot of talking. I'm not too chatty on it. I'm sort of shining a light on them and saying, what was your life like? What happened? And the inspiration for the podcast was actually writing structure. It was that kind of novel structure of like the point of no return and the climax, and then like what happened. Like where does the hero's journey take them? And so that's kind of the framework for me as an interviewer, is to like tell us what happened and how did you make it out? And that's on all platforms.
Oh, great. And tell us what it's called again.
And then everything changed. And you can't miss it because it's this garish yellow color, the little like, I was like, wow, I'm really working the bright colors for my brand here. I've got the orange behind me. I've got the yellow for the podcast. Yeah.
You match the Zeitgeist brand colors.
Yes, so, that's right. That's why I was like, look at this graphic.
Yeah, right. Graphic. I dressed, we both wore black. I was like, what's going to match the book well, and everything. It's got to all work together.
Very thoughtful.
It's branding, it's packaging.
I know.
So the one last question I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned a couple, but what are some of your favorite memoirs?
Oh my gosh, this is such a good question. Okay, I'm reading Somebody's Daughter right now by Ashley Ford. This is not a memoir, but I do want to just say, I just read Negative Space by Lily Danziger. I'm about to read Goodbye, Sweet Girl by Kelly
Mm.
Sundberg. One of my very, very favorite memoirs. Here's a couple. They're all rolling in my head now. The Iceberg by Marion Cootes, which is not one that a lot of my friends know about, but it's gorgeously written, very beautiful. I love This Boy's Life, of course, by Tobias Wolff. That was sort of a touchstone for me. And I really, yes, it was a touchstone for me for sure. And I really love Hollywood Park by Mikel Jolet. It's a very dense memoir, but it's gorgeous. It's also about look, I see. Okay. Also,
yes, we apparently interviewed him. I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's charming and lovely. And you should listen to that podcast episode. It's like a 35-minute one. And then, what was I going to say? And then one of my favorite authors of all time, I just love All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Toews. And I love Women Talking by Miriam Toews. Like that was a breathtaking book. I love it when a book makes me forget it's a book. And that did it for me. It just slayed me. So yeah.
All right, I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this later and like write all these
I'm happy to play through my list too, because I'm a memoir fiend these days.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So tell us where we will put up a link to Bookshop where people can get a copy of your book. Where else are there any other bookstores, local bookstores out in Seattle where you are?
Yeah. Third Place Books has my book. Queen Anne Books has my book. Like people have the book, and North Bank Books in Stevenson has my book. I mean, they have my book, and you can find me. Everything I do is under my name. I finally realized, it should be under my name. So it's ronitplank.com. I'm on Instagram every day, probably too much. Ronit
yes,
Plank.
I've seen you there.
I'm like, let me post this. Let me post this.
Hey,
this is fun. Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. Well, otherwise you have to let people know you're there, and then Twitter, Facebook. But I'm there under Ronit Plank, and you can find my podcast there and my upcoming appearances on my website too.
Awesome. All right. Well, Julie, behind the scenes there, we have a winner of a copy of When She Comes Back. Drum roll, please. Liz Havens, you are the winner of the book. Woohoo!
Woohoo! So, Liz, I can't wait to send it to you.
Yes. So, Liz, what you need to do, if you're there, hopefully you're still there, is send a private message to us via our Facebook page. You'll get like a robotic reply, but don't worry about that, with your address. Or you can email us, amightyblaze@gmail.com, and just say that you won on the Zeitgeist When She Comes Back, and we'll get a book out to you as soon as we can. So
fun.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Ronit. It was wonderful to meet you. And I'm sure I will, see you out there on the internets, and
for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy you and I got to do this. Thank you.
Yes. Likewise. Thanks, everyone.